Now for today's program. Eetta Prince-Gibson is Moment's Israel editor and the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report. In addition to Moment, she is a regular contributor to Foreign Policy, Haaretz, Time, and other prominent publications. Eetta has been on assignment around the world covering crisis and conflict and has received the Clarion Award, the National Religion Writers Award, the Search for Common Ground Award, and several Rock Hour Awards. Before transitioning to journalism, Eetta worked as a clinical social worker and pursued postgraduate studies in the Harvard Medical School system, where she specialized in psychosocial trauma. Today, in addition to her writing, Eetta is a member of the Dina Project for recognition and justice for the victims of October 7th. Joining Eetta today is Moment editor Sarah Breger. Sarah is also the director of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including First Place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association and First Place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Eetta Prince-Gibson and Sarah Breger.
Thank you, Suzanne, for organizing this, and thank you, Eetta, for being here, for staying up late to join us.
Thank you for having me.
When we first started talking about this program on Wednesday, there were a lot of unknowns. We didn't know if the ceasefire would go through. We didn't know if it would be approved by the cabinet, when hostages would start being released. There's still a lot of unknowns right now too, which I think we're going to discuss. But I'm sure you watched live, like me, like probably everyone on this Zoom. The three female hostages, Romy Gonen, Emily Damari, and Doron Steinbrecher, first be reunited with their mothers, then be reunited with the rest of their families, in a very emotional moment. I'm curious what the mood is in Israel right now.
The mood in Israel is always very changeable, and it changes from minute to minute. I mean, we were joking before about how are you? And I kind of said, well, what time is it? Yesterday, of course, was an amazing moment. Was it yesterday that they were?
I think it's two days ago now, but yeah.
Sunday. Yeah. And yes, I watched it, and then of course we all ran out, and I was at the play in Jerusalem at the big tent is in Tel Aviv, but they're of the hostages, and there's a smaller tent in Jerusalem. And that pretty much was everything. And the mood was euphoric. And everybody wanted to know everything, to the point where, in fact, the Dina Project has already put out a call to journalists to please leave them alone and, let the hostages heal. And to find a balance between the public's right to know and the need of them to reunite with their families and just get on with their lives in any way they can. And the mood was euphoric, and everybody wanted to know, and people you saw on the streets were smiling, and it happened. It's 10 o'clock at night, just after 10 here in Israel, and in 2 days the mood can change a lot. First of all, in addition to the release of the hostages, we did see that horrific show of force and disdain and hatred by Hamas as they were being released, with the guns up in the air, and people masked, their faces covered. And the truth is that there were a few moments that I was actually scared that one of the hostages, having survived that long, was going to be shot. We put it all aside for a few minutes to be euphoric and happy, but now it's back. There was just a terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. My son gives the usual, I'm okay, considering that it was a few meters from his house. Also, the political is coming much more to the front. The euphoria is over. I guess, like the hostages are, it's coming down. There was some reporting the first thing they're going to do is have their nails done and their hair cut. But at some point they're going to face the reality of what they've been through. Well, we're facing the reality as a public, that there are more questions than answers right now about the entire situation. That we don't trust, the majority of the public doesn't trust Bibi, even Bibi supporters. Bibi referring, of course, to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What's going on in the West Bank and the craziness of the past few days in the massive attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, and a feeling of the hostages coming once again their lives. And now there was a moment where they represented all of us, and that's wonderful. It's also not real. They have to live their lives. And the public is now living a life, I think, of we haven't got a clue what's going to happen. It is very clear that there are parts of written agreements that are not released to the public. The government has said so, that they've not released everything because of security reasons. So we don't know. We don't know what we've agreed to. We don't know what it means. We don't know that even the first 42 days will happen, which are now, of course, on our time 40. We don't know that 30 more hostages will be released. We don't know that the fighting won't start again. So the mood is not what it was if we would have had this Sunday evening. We also are concerned about who promised what in terms of Trump and Bibi. As I wrote in the piece, the bromance is over. And anybody who, of course, read some of the books that came out about, the deal of the century and Trump's ideas about Saudi Arabia knows that he could abandon Bibi, but what does that mean for us? What's been promised? The mood is dread. I mean, I think certainly not like it's been for the past 2 years, but dread.
Just for people to know, the article that Eetta is referring to is one she published on Moment on Thursday, explaining the hostage deal. And actually, I was going to ask you if maybe you could explain to people here, what are the 3 phases and what do they entail? And actually, I hadn't heard that there was some stuff that we didn't really know. So maybe you could talk
We
about
don't
this
know. It
unknown
was published
part.
by Alex. When we hear in Israeli parlance, senior sources in the government office or senior governmental sources is a code word for Netanyahu or a spokesman. I mean, that's high. We have buzzwords like all journalists, and so that was confirmed. The 3 stages are 42 days, during which Israel is to not completely redeploy, but withdraw to a buffer strip, which Israel is doing, to allow increased aid and the hostages to be released in a phased, which was not spelled out. So, for instance, it's only yesterday that it was confirmed that the next 3, I believe it's actually 4, will be released on Shabbat. So, we don't know exactly what the stages, all these 3 stages are, but those are the primary, that there will be increased humanitarian aid, and Israel will release Palestinian prisoners at a key of how many live prisoners and how many of them are women, live hostages, I'm sorry, referring to civilians, and a key to soldiers, to female soldiers. The male soldiers and the dead are to be released only in phase 2. Phase 2 is to begin in 40 days, 42 days after the start. However, the discussion of phase 2 is to start in 2 weeks minus 2 days. So we are, we're basically looking at 2 weeks until it could blow up. Then it could blow up at any time. During phase 2, there's supposed to be a final status agreement. Israel to completely withdraw all Palestinian prisoners and all hostages, alive or dead. Supposedly, there won't be very many alive left, to be returned, and we live happily ever after. I don't know that that's going to happen. I'll be happy if we finish stage 1 at this point. I'm not so sure we will.
Well, that's what it sounds like. Most people believe that stage 2 will never happen. And, I think there's various reasons why, but how do the, families of the hostages who are not in the first deal, how are they reacting to that?
The call by all of the hostages, and it's interesting because the hostage families, and it's interesting because it's both left and right, are saying all of them have to be returned. That's also, even that is a complicated statement, because they're probably hostages that nobody knows where they're buried, whether because they were buried in mass graves, which were subsequently the ground, what was above them was destroyed by Israel, whether the people who knew, who did the burials don't know where are dead or gone or who knows what, or people that we really never knew. As some of our readers may be aware, there was a Yazidi woman found in Gaza who was traded apparently from Daesh, from ISIS, to Hamas or the Islamic Jihad. Somebody knew that, but we sure didn't. And apparently there are several more. So I don't even know what we're talking about. More concern is what is the unknown part. And my guess is that Trump is saying that's the real part we don't know. What did Trump promise Bibi, and what did Bibi promise Trump? And since we know that Trump can also change his opinion quickly because he's so transactional and not ideological or agreement oriented, he's transaction oriented, we think it's the permission to go back in, to find a reason. And even some of the cynicism is to say Bibi's counting on Hamas to violate the agreement. And it doesn't even have to be Hamas. There's Islamic Jihad hanging out there. And there are all sorts of other tiny groups that we don't know about. And somebody could lob something and hurt, and it would be successful in that it would hurt somebody and not land in area, and it wouldn't even be Hamas. And it could, and Bibi could use that, rightly or wrongly, depending on your perception, to go back in. We also have a set of conflicting statements. And when you're asking why are we also convinced that, or not convinced, but concerned that stage 2 will not begin, because there's so many conflicting statements. We will not leave until, on the side of Israel, we will not leave until there is a total victory. Beats me what that means. There will never be Hamas must be eliminated and cannot control Gaza. No discussion of who's supposed to be there then. What does that mean if the if the Palestinian Authority is not being allowed? We will demand the release of the very last hostage. If Hamas violates at any point, we will go back in. How do we square all these ideas? None of them work together. They contradict each other practically and conceptually, together with the fact that we know we don't even know half of what we think we know. So that's why we're a little bit in dread.
Well, that leads to a bigger question of, and you alluded to this with the Hamas fighters, outside the Red Cross van. I mean, were the goals of this war achieved? And what were the goals? I think we never were completely clear about that.
The initial goal was to bring back the hostages and wipe out Hamas. Little by little, bring back the hostages disappeared from the list of goals and wipe out Hamas. But it was wipe out Hamas from control, not nobody. I mean, I don't know what wipe out Hamas meant to anybody else. To me, it meant, wipe out their control. That morphed into total victory as the goal of the war, which nobody has a clue what that's supposed to mean. It's a slogan, it's a wave the flag slogan. I don't know what it means. Always the goals, even the stated goals of bring back the hostages and eliminate Hamas were contradictory. First of all, you can't eliminate Hamas, you can't eliminate anything unless you have a ground force. Bringing in ground forces put, as we know, the hostages at risk. So the goals were never clear. If I were to be very political, I would say the goals were to keep Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in office, so that he would not have to face elections or his trial or the implications of the failure of October 7th.
Well, I mean, that actually leads us to a question about the government and, what will happen if more people quit the government because of the ceasefire deal. Perhaps you could explain a little bit about how Ben-Gvir left and how, if Smotrich stays, what will happen.
Well, right now, because Ben-Gvir left, Bibi has a 62 person coalition. He needs 60. That's pretty razor thin. However, and this is the absurdity, if he will have a minority government, which in theory would fall, because Smotrich and probably some others will pull out and will vote against a ceasefire deal. However, can you actually see the opposition also voting against a ceasefire deal? So in the end, the absurdity of it is that the opposition may have to give him support, because this is the ideology of, this is the ideology of the center left. If I were a voter, I cannot see myself voting against a ceasefire, even if I understand the irony and the absurdity of how that's playing out numerically. So we may see Lapid saving Bibi, Yair Lapid, head of the opposition, saving the coalition in what could be one of the more bizarre acts of Israeli politics.
And I mean, do people think that's going to happen, or do they think that Bibi is going to kind of perhaps start fighting again to kind of give in to what Smotrich is asking?
One thing we have to know is that Netanyahu loves to do things at the last minute. He never makes decisions ahead of time. He always looks for what he can juggle. And, as he juggles, very often some other ball comes in that changes the pattern of the juggling, and somehow all the balls stay in the air. So that's, would I put money on the fact that the government would fall? No. Also, we have to remember he ultimately, if he's counting, I think at least in some point on Hamas blowing it. If in the next 2 weeks, terrorists come back. I'm sorry, hostages come back, looking much worse than they did. If there is an attack, as I said, as the hostages were being released and watching that horrible display of strength and hatred, but also to give the hostages, even at the last second as they're leaving Gaza, a horrible experience, so that was what they had to leave with. As if 471 days weren't enough, let's give you another few hours. Public opinion could support it, and then he won't have to risk his coalition. Uh, Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but we have so many unknowns in this equation. You can't solve it.
Well, I mean, right now it seems like most of the Israeli public is for a ceasefire deal. I think I read something
Correct.
that
Correct.
70% are.
Yes.
Um,
There's the idea. I came out with a statement. I wrote it down in order to be able to quote it. The Israel Democracy Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Jerusalem. And I have to say, as a journalist, I very much respect their work and do use their polls frequently. 58% of the entire public, it's higher among the Arab public, but the general public, support a deal in full, including at the cost of leaving Hamas in power. Add to that an additional 12% who specifically say they're in favor of the first stage, even if they don't know what they think about the second stage. So yes, you were correct. As of last week, you were looking at a clear 70%. That is a large percent of anything, but in Israel, where nobody agrees on anything, it's a tremendously strong showing. We don't usually see those kinds of numbers here on anything.
I'm curious about, I think, the 30% who aren't for a deal. What are their reasons? And do you think maybe their reasons may have changed in the
Well,
past few
some of them are
days?
saying, and that's the bit about the 12. That's the 12%. We're saying first stage, which is that second stage may never happen. And then what we are going to wind up with is we're going to wind up with 63 hostages never returning. We're going to have, assume we have 95 now. Out of the 33, 3 have been returned. So we're looking at 95. Let's say 30 come back, and then stage 2 never happens. That means that 60 some hostages may never come back. Hamas may kill them, may parade them. We genuinely, that is one of the things that is leading the opposition, especially by some of the family members. There is an extreme right that is saying, no, we have to settle Gaza. We can't give it up. At a minimum, we can't redeploy, move out of all of Gaza. We must hold on to some of it. Some of them using it's God's promise. Gaza is part of the greater land of Israel. Others saying, using a more security-oriented presentation, that where there are no settlements, where there's no Israeli presence, there is terror. So that's another place. The other is, until we know what is replacing Hamas, I would qualify that by saying if Hamas is to be replaced, before we say about by what. Until we know that, we shouldn't be pulling out. So the 40% or the 30%, depending on, if you're including the 12%, are made up of several different groups.
The group of people who are talking about resettling Gaza, I mean, I think, they're in the news a lot. You see them in the news a lot, but are they actually large, or is it just they're very noisy?
They weren't very large when they started settling the West Bank either, were they? Daniela Weiss, who's somebody that I've interviewed frequently, and she says, yeah, well, that's what it was like when we first went into Hebron. Remember, the whole thing in the West Bank started with the Seder night in Hebron, actually in Kiryat Arba. But and a couple of families that moved in. And so, I hate to quote this in this context, but it was Margaret Mead, I believe, who said, never doubt what a small group of determined people can do. We always think of that as social change in a progressive way. But if it's so, then it's so in every direction. And these are very dedicated, very serious people. I have written about them. I wrote about them, oh dear, it was about a year ago, when they were less organized and less ready to move. There are people sitting in the South, having left their homes already, ready to move. They have clear programs. They have detailed logistics, where they're getting caravans, where they're getting water, how they're hooking up generators. These people are ready to go. And they may not be a majority, but they're serious. And what does a majority mean? They are easily several hundred families.
Mhm. I mean, it seems it's hard for me to believe that, people are willing to, go on miluim for, and leave their families in order to help other people resettle Gaza, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, that's another thing, which is there was already that's another issue that Bibi's going to have to face. There was already what we call a gray refusal, a kind of under the table refusal, not ostensibly based on ideological or political reasons, but I can't go back to Miluim not because I've already served 300
Oh,
days.
I'm sorry. Someone asked, I should have defined miluim as
I'm
reserve
sorry,
duty.
reserve duty.
Yeah.
There are people who have since October 7th done as many as 400 days of reserve duty. They have spent the majority of their time on reserve duty, and a not small proportion of the dead and wounded are reservists. The concept, just to answer that question, the concept of the Israeli army is that the standing army, the conscripted army, will hold the lines until the reservists come in. But we've never had a war that lasted this long. We have no idea how to look at this. Even with goodwill, the social welfare agencies and the agencies that are supposed to be paying, what if you have an independent business? What if you're self-employed? All these, what if you're a professional of any kind, working in your own office as a lawyer or any kind of service? We don't have answers for this because this never happened. The Yom Kippur War lasted 23 days, and by March, it began in October, and people were out of Miluim mostly by March. We have close to 480 days with no end in sight. What we may be looking at is already, as I said, we're looking at a gray refute, what we call the Saruva, the gray, undeclared. I can't go because my wife is going to give birth, because I have to have surgery on my left toe. We're beginning to see an awful lot of that. The army is complaining, that the higher ups are complaining miserably that they just don't have the manpower, and in most cases it is manpower. We're also seeing that the army is tired. They're making dumb mistakes. There are a lot of things going wrong that didn't have to go wrong. Not car accidents, but equipment malfunctions, things that seem to say that there's a degradation of the capability and capacity, mostly because people are tired. I think that if we actually pull out, I mean, there's a limit to how long you can serve and still be at your highest, especially when you're not an 18 gung ho. I always say there's a reason that all armies conscript kids, because they're probably the only ones who are dumb enough to do it. At age 36, you have a different view of life. and your values may change. Well, we know values change over age. I would anticipate that if we pull back and then there's a going in, unless it's on the basis of something outrageous that Hamas did, we're going to see open refusal. Not, because of this or that, but no, kind of a hell no, we won't go. And, ultimately that will change things as well. There'll also be increased pressure on the ultra Orthodox who aren't showing any signs of agreeing to enlist.
And just to go back to, those who are against a deal, one group we didn't really talk about were, those who may be against the deal because, they are against the people who are going to be let out, the Palestinian prisoners who are going to be let out. So many people I know have been talking about, people they know who have been murdered, whose murderer is now at least slated to get out. And then the group of people who say, what we're doing is just encouraging more hostage
Yes.
in the future.
Well, we know that when people get out, when Palestinian prisoners get out, many of them go back to terrorism. They did in this war too. And yes, we are going to see families who are going to stand there with the picture of their daughter or son or family member and the picture of the prisoner being released. Moreover, we will probably see Nukba, the people who committed the crimes in October, being released. Right now, we're going to see women, but some of those women were responsible for terrorist acts as well. But mostly the people are saying, even though it's hard, the 58% includes, even though it's awful. I mean, nobody wants to see these people released. And although in some views, and I know I've read this in the international press, Israeli hostages, Palestinian prisoners, no, we don't see any balance here or any equivalency here. We see them very, very, very differently. Not to mention that hostage taking is in fact a war crime of civilians. Having said that, again, we're going to have to look at what the mood is going to look like and if Bibi will ride on that. There's no question in my mind that what he would prefer is to go back in. Will he be able to renew the war is a different question, and on the basis of what? But public opinion is so labile that we don't know. And we can count on Hamas probably to do something very stupid.
And you had mentioned Donald Trump and kind of the Donald Trump of it all and the unknown. What are people, talking about or worried about? Yesterday he said he doesn't think the ceasefire might not hold, which is very different from what he said a few days ago. So things seem to be shifting, rapidly.
I never know how much to pay attention, and it's true. I'm not an American reporter. How much to pay attention to everything that Trump says versus over a long time. To look at consistency, not from statement to statement, but over a period of time. One thing we know, the deal of the century was his pride. That's Saudi Arabia. I cannot imagine that there would be any agreement with Saudi Arabia that would not include some arrangement for the Palestinians. So that he has said consistently. Did he want what he got in terms of his inauguration and and how good it looked and I brought peace and all of that? Yeah, okay, he got that, but is that really all he wanted, not to care what goes on? Unless he wants Saudi Arabia. Israel has very little to offer him. Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer, and a lot in terms of changing the geopolitics of our region. And Saudi Arabia leads to a lot of other things. So yeah, he did say, I don't know if it'll hold. He actually said, I think he doubts it'll hold. But what's up again, consistently, Saudi Arabia and changing geopolitics in the region.
Do his more right-wing supporters in Israel who, called him, King Trump, are they having buyer's remorse?
I don't think it's buyer's remorse. I think they're a little surprised, and still saying we don't believe. When push comes to shove, he will support us, if only because of his evangelical base. I mean, Israelis are counting on a lot of kind of strange things here. Maybe the evangelicals will save us because that's his base. That I don't know, but I would think that if Hamas goes, or if there is how to say it, at least a prima facie reason, justification for resuming the war, I would assume there would be American support for it by Trump's base, as well as by Trump. And anyway, then it would only be for a while, and we'll just clean up, and then we'll get them back out, and etc.
Right. I mean, we've also seen, Steve Witkoff, his new envoy, seems to be much tougher than most other envoys in the past on Netanyahu.
Oh yeah.
He's also expressed, perhaps one could argue more sympathy for Gazans than, previous envoys. So it's kind of interesting to watch that happen.
Yeah, the big story was that he called Bibi on Friday night, and that Bibi's people said, "It's Shabbat. Can't we wait until Saturday night?" And he said, "No way." Got him up and dressed and out there, which that was kind of a fun little tidbit that was making the rounds here. Another thing, by the way, which I think is interesting, that the meeting on Friday, the cabinet and then subsequently the government meeting to approve it went into Shabbat.
Mhm.
And the ultra-Orthodox left with notes that they supported it, quoting, "It is a great mitzvah to redeem hostages," and left their votes in writing, and that it was okay to continue the meeting because it was saving lives. So that was kind of what we call in Hebrew word religion, pikuach nefesh, saving lives. So that was the kind of support you were seeing, and it was all Ben Gvir could do and Smotrich could do was kind of whine, and it sounded like politically it sounded like whining. It was not a strong statement. We'll see where that goes.
So what's been going on in the West Bank for the past 3 days?
The settlers, I'm saying the settlers because I no longer, obviously it's a minority of the settlers, and it's probably what we refer to as the hilltop youth.
Yeah.
There's an entire group of some of them not so young, in their late 20s, early 30s, of pretty lawless, uncontrollable, they were kids, extremists who have developed these concepts of Jewish supremacy and real hatred for Palestinians, hatred on the most personal level, which we had not seen as much until about two. There were extremists, but we thought they were extremists. When we talked about the terrorists, the underground, the settler underground, about 30 years ago, that was appalling. The problem, of course, they are the children. Many of them are the children of settlers, but they have no control. But the adults have no. I'm saying the adults have absolutely no control over them. What they are doing, they are going into settlements, burning, attacking, um, beating, throwing anything they can, rampaging, killing livestock, stoning cars, any kind of violence that they particularly feel like. Some of them are not even masked anymore. And this has grown in the past few days. This has been over the top more, both quantitatively and in terms of how violent and how widespread it is. Sadly, the government is doing nothing. And the police are doing nothing. Now, of course, since Ben-Gvir quit, we're not quite sure who's running the police anyway. But what we know is that the decision was made by the Minister of Defense to put an end to administrative detention for Jews, for settlers. So, no, Palestinians can be put under administrative detention.
Can you explain what administrative detention is?
Administrative detention is it's that they can be put under house arrest or even jail without any legal proceedings. On the basis, I do believe it requires some sort of a legal proceeding, but it does not require a trial. It's not a usual open trial. Often used in cases where, especially with Palestinians, by the way, where to have an open trial would be to reveal sources, to reveal informants.
So they're stopping
administrative detention, yeah. That administrative detention is an administrative procedure that bypasses usual democratic and liberal proceedings of trial and, etc. Rarely used against Jews, but there were a few. Often it's, as I said, it's used because they don't want to reveal informants, or it's because you want to get this person under control real fast.
Mhm.
The Minister of Defense, I believe about 10 days ago or so, a week ago, declared that Jews would be released from administrative detention. So what we have now is recidivism. I mean, some of these people who, I don't even know recidivism, at least they were being held in their homes, are running around again. And these people have no controls. More concern to me is their ideology, which is such an ideology of Jewish supremacy.
Mhm.
In so many ways, the anti-Arab sentiment in Israel was so different than the racism, let's say, of the United States at the time, of Jim Crow or even before. It's becoming much more looking that way, of this hatred, that this is not merely, quote, merely, a nationalistic struggle. It's a supremacist. These Arabs have no right to live. They are subhuman beings. Threats, we will rape your women, things that we had not heard. And the government is doing nothing right now. There are no arrests, there are no trials, there have not been for years, and now certainly less.
Yeah, you even see, religious Zionist rabbis kind of saying this has gone too far and speaking up and saying, you're corrupting what we're trying to teach, which is something that's new.
And there's no control over them. Nobody can control them.
I want to get to people's questions, but I also want to talk about Gaza for a second, because I think, in all these discussions or everything I've read, nobody's really talking about what's happening in Gaza, all the people who are returning to their homes that are most likely destroyed, looking for people who might be under the rubble. Is this at all in the Israeli media, Israeli consciousness? Are people thinking about this?
So much of the war started with this sense of revenge because of October 7th. And I think, probably many of our listeners or our viewers are aware of what exactly October 7th meant to Israelis. That's augmented by a couple of things. One is that nobody's allowed, Israeli journalists and internationals who are coming from here are not allowed into Gaza. So the reporting is primarily by the international press, which is not well regarded in Israel because it's viewed as biased. So if you want to know what's going on, yes, you can know. I can easily we are one of the most internet savvy people on the, we had smartphones before people know what they were. Yes, we can know. I think there was every reason for Israelis not to want to know. And as it got worse, there's even more reason not to know. At some point, the revenge just became something very frozen. I can't deal with it. Interestingly, yesterday, as there was the feed from, I believe it was Al Jazeera's feed, or maybe it was Egyptian, showing the Red Cross, and we kept on seeing the same pictures of the ambulances, and it wasn't clear if they had the women, they didn't have the young women. You could see the destruction. But what we were focused on was, well, are the girls inside or are they not inside? Are they free? Or, so I think what Israelis are beginning to certainly, I do think it's beginning to start. Although again, that scene on Sunday of the Hamas people and the mass collection around the girls, the young women, was very frightening. I mean, and it seemed that nobody was running the show. It was mass chaos. Didn't encourage anybody to care. And again, it becomes an issue of, why should I care? What were they doing about what was happening to our hostages? And the whole world is saying we're committing genocide anyway, so what's the point in paying attention? I think that Israelis will start to deal with it, especially when we come to terms with the fact that unless there is a serious rebuilding plan, we're going to look at a Somaliization, and they're going to crash the fences. I mean, they can't live like that. They're good. There's no water, there's no electricity, there's no health, there's nothing. And unless they start getting aid real quick and rebuilding real quick, then we're going to know that they're going to start, just as human beings, either trying to get into Egypt or into Israel to survive. And that's going to create a humanitarian view that will also be a political view.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Let me go to some people's questions.
Sure.
One person asked, to clarify, do we know that all the hostages to be released in phase 1 are alive? I believe, no, yeah. Didn't they say most are alive, but they didn't say
no,
what
what we know is that they committed to 33. What that means is 33 entities. Supposedly, preference is being given to the humanitarian. The list that Hamas gave, which, by the way, Hamas gave at the last possible minute, just to be as nasty as possible. And again, the scuttlebutt is that it was only when the Qataris said to them, stop it and give the list, that they actually provided the list. All of them are alive. However, it does include, for instance, the twins, the Bibas twins, not twins, the brothers, the little redheads. Yeah. Are they really alive? These are very young children. So we don't know. And we also don't know the fact that they may produce somebody who is no longer alive as part of the next 4 doesn't mean that all the others aren't. In other words, we don't know how to draw conclusions from what we're seeing. We do know that they're committed to 33, and that if at some point they don't have 33 live, they're going to start including deceased.
I'm sure psychologically that must be, extremely difficult for the Israeli public.
Very difficult. And, the people who just as it was with, Hirsch, Goldberg, Poland, and and to think that they made it
Yeah.
until the last possible second, and then they actually executed them. Just felt so cruel. Guys, as if you want to say the Hamas, you lost the game. You lost this move. Let them live. I know that's naive and that's not how wars are, and that's not how people are, and that's probably not what Israel would have done either, because war isn't nice. It's not supposed to be, but it was heartbreaking. And right now, the tension, I mean, imagine for some of these family members not knowing, nor did they know. I mean, one of the things that everybody kept on saying as they were watching them is they're walking.
Right.
They look alert. There was also a fear that you were going to see somebody on a wheelchair who was looking in a vegetative state. Maybe they'd been beaten. Maybe they were so traumatized that they couldn't walk. That was very much the comment. No, they're sitting there wearing hot pink sweats. It's a hot pink outfit and sweatpants, and she can walk. She can respond. So imagine what the families are going through.
And you mentioned Hirsch, and that's related to another question we had about, if this was the same deal that's been on the table for the past 8 months, like some people have been saying, are people angry about that?
Very, very. There's overwhelming support for. I don't know the most recent data, but for getting rid of this government. What that would mean in terms of Bibi is a different question. I mean, that becomes a political position. But there's certainly a thinking that this government, that Netanyahu, were he in a coalition not with the extremists, would act differently. And that in fact his political concern for himself is an opening. But right now there's tremendous rage. This didn't have to happen. This is the same deal, barring what we don't know, that we could have had. And don't forget, it's not just the hostages that we lost, it's the soldiers that we lost as well, fighting to release the hostages or for total victory, when the hostage deal was available in May, and total victory will probably never be. So it's tragic.
One person wanted to know, why are the trade numbers so disparate? 30 hostages, captured by Hamas for almost 2,000 Palestinians.
One, because we have so many.
Mhm.
They don't have those kinds of numbers, and they would never in a million years agree to equal numbers. I think it's also a bit of, our statement of how much lives are worth and the value of life. But also remember that because there's such vast numbers of Palestinians in jails, it's not only an emotional issue for Palestinian society, it's a practical issue. There's an awful lot of families without husbands or fathers or bread earners. There's a lot of that.
How many soldiers have fallen since October 7th, if you know?
It's over 4 since October 7th, including October 7th.
Either one.
Including October 7th, probably about 800.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the vicinity of 400. Remember, those numbers are never correct because some of the people who are wounded will die. We could be waiting to hear, as I wrote once, you wake up in the morning and you listen to the news, or I do. And these people who wakes up, my alarm is also a radio. And I hear the 6 o'clock news, and I'm listening for Hutar lefirsum, which means it has been permitted to release the name of.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is, of course, that families have already been informed, because if the families aren't informed, then if the military were to say 5 soldiers died yesterday in a training accident, you understand that every family, I mean, when my son was in, if I would have heard that when he was in Gaza, of course I would have assumed. So that if you have not received the notice, it's okay. So it's over 400.
And 2 questions that are kind of related. One is there a group in Gaza, who's not Hamas, who could be part of a new government? And do you think Israel is genuine in wanting to pursue a 2-state solution? And who would that be with?
Yeah. Hamas has never allowed any alternative entity to come forward. In the situation that we have now, is there any kind of a technocratic group that could take it over? The answer would be no. That would have to come from the PA, from the Palestinian Authority, which would be giving credence and validity to the Palestinian Authority, which would be pushing us to a 2-state solution. Despite his announcement in Bar-Ilan University what seems like eons ago, Netanyahu has shown absolutely no interest, and in fact severe opposition to anything that would resemble a 2-state solution. His government is certainly opposed to it. And in fact, that's the reason that we have no idea what the day after means. Remember, in 12 days, we're going to start talking about what the end is going to look like. And I'm thinking, who is supposed to be part of that? What is the ultimate solution, the end state supposed to look like? Who's supposed to be there? I don't see any international force that could actually do this or want to do it. So I don't know. Is there support for a 2-state solution in Israel? Mixed data. And that would very much depend on what you mean and what we're getting. The more you qualify it, the higher the numbers go up. I mean, if you ask, are you in favor of a 2-state solution, you're going to get a very low number.
Mm-hmm.
A 2-state solution that would guarantee Israel's security starts bumping up. It's such a vague term. And I have to say that many of us, and I'll speak for myself, I don't care if it's a 2-state or a 27-state solution. I want to know that it guarantees security for the Palestinians, security for us, identity, political identity, and ability to live our lives as who we are, in a creative way and a peaceful way. Just not as only as individuals, but as collectives, as in this case, Jews and Israelis, Palestinians as Muslims and Christians, and any other identities that they observe. So how we actually divide up the borders, and if we call them 2, 3, or as I said, 27, is less important to me than what are we looking at on a functional level. And that is, of course, an inclusive security attitude. We've drawn lines on the map. In Jerusalem, there's over 100 solutions being proposed for Jerusalem, and all they do is draw borders. And the borders change according to how thick the pencil is.
Yeah, that's true.
Seriously.
Well, thank you, Eetta, for talking to us. I definitely learned a lot. And also, I just want to thank everyone for their comments in the chat. I know we didn't get to, go through them, but they were also very interesting as well. And hopefully we can do this again with good news.
Amen. And thank you all for listening and for your support in whatever position you take. But knowing that Israel isn't alone over here is very important to all of us. So your interest is very encouraging to all of us. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to Moment, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.